we're going to start by taking a look at a country that's barely been out of the news over the past decade. That is Syria. This war was, of course, started after the Assad regime brutally cracked down on protesters, demanding greater freedom and democracy, which was part of the wider Arab Spring protests. Fast forward nearly 11 years now, and the country's, I think it's fair to say, has been absolutely devastated. Numerous sides locked in conflict for over a decade, including the Assad regime itself, numerous rebel groups, the Kurdish militias in the north, and Daesh. Reports of war crimes and various atrocities have been leveled against many sides in this conflict, notably, for one, the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime against its own civilians. Various international players have also intervened in this war to varying extents, including the United States, including Russia, and including Turkey. Excuse me. However, it's now been announced that Syria has signed a memorandum of understanding with China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is Xi Jinping's flagship initiative to reframe international trade around China. It's been going on for much of the past half decade or so. It's based on the old Silk Roads. That's the sort of dream that Xi Jinping has been trying to big up and romanticize this project. Much of the initiative has involved investment in infrastructure, such as rail and ports around the globe, but many of its critics have attacked this project as economic imperialism and as debt trap diplomacy. Kit, from the point of view of Syria, what was your reaction to this announcement? What do you think the Assad regime is trying to gain here?
What is very important to remember with Syria at the moment is we now have a country that has been absolutely devastated by 10 years of war now. The infrastructure in the country is in tatters. You've had large swathes of its major cities that are effectively in ruins, and some of them, particularly up in the north of the country, were cities like Aleppo, for example. There's a huge infrastructure problem, which is only going to exacerbate the enormous economic challenges that the country is going to be facing over the coming years as well. So just because you could definitely make the case that militarily the war is probably now as good as finished, and that the Assad regime has managed to hold its position. But in terms of how they're going to be moving forward in the country, they need some kind of support, basically. And even though they do have some international backing from Iran, they do have some international backing from Russia, neither of those countries is really in any position to be able to help them out financially, really. Iran is currently seeing its own fuel shortages, which is going to have a knock-on effect in terms of fuel supplies that are moving into other countries in the region, which includes Syria. And Russia is obviously seeing its own economic problems at the moment as well, and is preoccupied on its western border too in Ukraine as well, which we'll get to later. So basically, neither of these countries, even though they have been propping up the Assad regime, is really in much of a position to support it economically to the degree that it's going to need to stand any chance of a recovery over the next few years. I mean, I don't think there is going to be much of a recovery, regardless of what help there is, because the devastation is just too widespread and too deep, basically. But this may well be a way of trying to get some sort of backing that will help some kind of infrastructure rebuilding and some kind of beginnings of rebuilding the damage that's been happening over the last 10 years.
And what sort of damage have we seen? Because obviously one of the most shocking moments, perhaps, that was reported in the West was the destruction of the ancient temple of Palmyra by Daesh back at the height of their power. But of course, the devastation goes far beyond that. You know, we've seen Syria's infrastructure almost completely taken out by the war. How much is it going to take to rebuild Syria?
I think we're talking generations, basically. This, in terms of the physical recovery, the infrastructural recovery, we're still talking years and years and years. This is something which has ripped the heart out of an entire country. The actual infrastructure rebuilding, the damage, the physical damage to it. I mean, of course, the ancient city of Palmyra is irreplaceable, but that's just one aspect of it. Talking in terms of like the country's ability to function, that's going to take decades, I would think. And in terms of course, the actual psychological impact or emotional impact that it's had on the people in terms of the mass emigration that's happened as well, it's going to be generations, I think, before we can see anything like a functioning country, even with that backing.
But of course, a lot of commentators have talked about the war largely being over. The Assad regime does now control most of the territory in Syria, but in the northern provinces, especially in the northwest, there is still some conflict going on. Could you explain to us what's happening there?
Well, we still have a few territories in the north of the country that are holding out, but in terms of the actual strategic value and the actual strategic sort of conflict that's happened, it is effectively finished. I don't know if we're going to see any advances into those territories by the Assad regime in the future. It's certainly possible. It's certainly not something that I would rule out. But in terms of the actual strategic import and the ability of the people to actually effectively oppose Assad, it's not really about that anymore. It's about survival, effectively. Unfortunately, I think we have seen from the international backing of the Assad regime, many people would say that the moment of Russia's intervention, which is possibly orchestrated by Iranian allies as well, maybe, as a moment which effectively ensured the survival of Bashar al-Assad in his position. Certainly, he's beholden to those allies, but he is still in his position and he is still alive, which is a lot more than can be said from similar long-term Arab dictators that faced uprising in the Arab Spring. What I think is really important now is that the international community opposes any attempts to normalize relations with Syria, and I think, or with the Assad regime in particular. And what I think is a little bit disturbing about Syria signing into the Belt and Road Initiative is that this is an acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the Assad regime as well. It's not, I mean, sure, in terms of actual economic recovery, in terms of rebuilding infrastructure, it might help, but it is a tacit acknowledgement of the regime's legitimacy, which is something that really does need to be opposed by the international community. This is not something which is positive in that regard at all.
Yes, I mean, let's talk through that for a minute, because the reason why it's important, like you say, that the international community does not legitimize the Assad regime is due to the numerous reports of war crimes against his regime, including the use of chemical weapons against civilians. Could you talk us through what that's entailed? Because it's something a lot of people have heard about tangentially, but don't know too much about in detail. And of course, there are there's a lot of denialism floating around out there as well. Could you talk us through that?
Well, we've had a very important moment as regards the Syrian regime in recent weeks, because we have had the conviction of a former regime official in Germany of crimes against humanity, which is a very big moment because it is a legal acknowledgement that the regime has been committing war crimes. So some of the crimes that this former official was convicted of do include torture. They do include his working at a prison, which oversaw regular torture and all manner of just horrible things happening to the people who are being imprisoned there. This is a very important moment because we do have now a legal international acknowledgement that this has happened in the regime. There are other cases that are being prepared as well. And as far as I understand it, the legal teams behind this ruling that have worked for this ruling and the advocacy groups that surround them want to go as far as they can. They want to go as high up as they can in the regime. How that's going to be an enormous challenge. I think it would need a lot more backing from the international community than it currently has, but that's definitely a positive step to see that happening. As regards the treatment of civilians within Syria, there's not a great deal to say that hasn't already been said, really. The secret services are effectively terrorize the population. There's multiple reports, it's very well documented. There's some stories from survivors that attest that they effectively use kidnap and disappearance, but also amnesty as a way, as a weapon against the population to sow fear. It's yeah, what can you say? It's just awful. It's truly, truly awful. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, there have been several times throughout the war when it looked like Assad may be going the same way as Gaddafi and maybe going the same way as Mubarak, and that he would be the latest in a line of Arab dictators to fall during the Arab Spring. What saved him?
Well, I think there's two things that saved him, and that has just been the intervention of regional international allies. So yes, Assad's army was not doing so great at one point during the conflict, but then you have Iranian interference when you have proxies in Hezbollah coming over from Lebanon. This is an intervention that continues very strongly. There's a lot of back and forth over the border, the Syrian and Lebanese border, with Hezbollah fighters moving back and forth there as well. But I think the main moment which scuppered any chances of any intervention possibly from Western countries and European countries was Russia's intervention. This has provided him with an international legitimacy in addition to the huge military advantage that it gave the Assad regime, because it effectively gave forces that supported him control of the skies in the conflict as well. I know that many of the rebels at the time were asking for a no-fly zone in the country, for example, to be imposed by other nations.
Similar to Libya, then?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to say how things. I don't think we should really go and say how things might have gone down if things had been different, but that is what opposition forces were requesting at that time. But I think, unfortunately, Russia's intervention in that regard pretty much scuppered that chance. You have extraordinary scenes when you have US planes and US and Russian warplanes coordinating with each other, because you have US planes bombing Daesh positions in the north of the country, supporting Kurdish militias, and then you have Russian planes moving south to bomb rebel positions and civilians, which again is documented. But you have these air forces actually coordinating with each other to make sure they don't encroach on each other's airspace as they're going on their various sorties. It's just extraordinary. It's a mess. But you can see the unwillingness of other members of the international community to intervene. I think, to me, that discovering that was happening was the moment that kind of reinforced to me that no, there's not going to be anything happening here to assist people.